Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for inviting me to speak, and thanks to all of you for coming to UMass Boston. It's a privilege to have all of you here. I work quite a bit on religious conflict, racial conflict, ethnic conflict, anything in dealing with identity issues in particular. I've done a lot of work in Nigeria on the Muslim-Christian divide, but I've also done work with racial divisions here in Boston, as well as ethnic or sub-identity issues among refugees here in the greater Boston area. So I'm going to draw on some learning from all of this different work. And perhaps a little bit different than skills, I want to talk a little bit about strategy in terms of how to structure processes in dealing across these sorts of religious and racial divides, both of which I think are very much present in our concerns in the United States today. I think the first thing I wanted to share was that, at least speaking for myself as a facilitator, I often had the assumption that the groups didn't know each other well enough as a starting place, but actually that's not correct. In fact, at least in my experience, I've found that groups in conflict actually think that they know each other very well. They think they know all about each other. I'm a Christian Nigerian. I know all about those Muslims. I know what they think. I know how they work. I'm a white man in the United States. I know all about black people who are Hispanics. I think I know where they come from. I think I know those sorts of backgrounds, and so on. So the initial inclination of trying to get groups to know each other better, I think fumbles on two key areas. First are cultural dispositions. In other words, stereotypes. Certainly, groups in conflict already come to the table with a tremendous amount of stereotypes about each other, or stereotypical knowledge that they presume about the other group, based on their limited experiences or their deep experiences with groups from the other side. So, first and foremost, we need to get populations to question their assumptions about one another, and individualizing the interaction. And I think a lot of the methodologies that many of you already use very much deal with this. My favorite in this regard, certainly, and one of my heroes, Dave Joseph at Public Conversations Project, is going to talk more, I think, about some of the methodologies there. So dealing with stereotypes, I'm going to set that aside because there's a much a deep literature and a deep practice about it. But there's a second piece of this that I do want to spend much more time talking about. And this is the different histories that groups in conflict come together with. So a different sense of the facts that are contested from the beginning, even though there was a common experience of events over long periods of time or over short periods of time. Different groups have a different telling of those histories and often have very fundamental differences about what the facts are of what happened in a particular situation. Now, some of this can be dealt with in the workshop models that we, and I'm talking about workshops very generically here. I think any sort of methodology where we bring two groups together to have some sort of an individualized experience of one another. In those circumstances, personal stories can go a long way towards contradicting that experience. So I'm a white man in the United States. I had one experience of the last 10 years. You may be Hispanic and you had a different experience of the last 10 years. And as we tell those stories, certainly that can help to bring out that history in a different way. But I found, at least in dealing with groups in conflict, particularly when some sort of identity dimension is involved, they often want evidence. They need some sort of data that is going to contradict the experience or their telling of history as they see it. And so I think I'd like to spend more time talking about how do you do that? How do you try to bring history or evidence or data into the conversation in some way that can change things? So we have a white police officer is accused of shooting a black teenager. There are going to be two different perspectives on what the data is that happened there. We have a Christian militia goes into a Muslim village in Nigeria. There's going to be two different histories of the killings that took place there and who did what, and so on, right? So there's different historical perspectives. How do we get that evidence presented in a way that can try to break open the conversation when simple individual interaction may not be enough. So I want to suggest 4 different sort of vehicles for that, and then end up on some of the sort of psychology that's behind this as well. First is the approach that I'm most familiar with are interreligious vehicles for fostering dialogue. And there are many ways of doing this, but one sort of evidential thing that we can do in interreligious dialogues is explaining, for instance, religious texts and practices. And this is a common vehicle you'll see many parts of the world, where we try to bring together religious figures and they bring their religious text with them. And so I can talk about the Bible, you can talk about the Quran, and so on, and we can not only read each other's religious texts, but we can actually try to interpret those for one another. And these interpretations are actually very, very important because, for instance, again, in Nigeria, the Christian groups that I talk to actually have real deep perspectives about Islam and about the interpretation of the Quran, of the Sunnah, and other sort of sacred perspectives. And it's really important for them to hear the Muslims talk about it, but just as important and very interesting is when a group of Muslims are disagreeing about the interpretations, or when the group of Christians are disagreeing about the interpretations of their own sacred texts. For the 2 groups to hear each other disagree is a really important aspect of processes that I've seen on the ground. And engineering that sort of interaction is very, very important. So it's not just the information, the Quran says this or the Quran says that, or the Bible says this or the Bible says that, but the interpretation of the 2 groups and the differences that happen within the intra-group dynamic is also very, very important. And in addition is that if you're working with religious figures in this context, is that if the religious figures themselves can reach across those divides, then they themselves can be very powerful figures in reaching out to their own communities. And so the folks that we work with bring together imams and pastors, and they talk to each other in a way that if it can reach across the divide, they can then talk to their congregations in an interesting fashion. I begin with that because I think you can do similar things with historians or researchers. For instance, on race or on American history. These researchers can come together and they can talk about the science of history. They can talk about what were the facts as we know them on the ground, and they can present that research in a fashion that can have that similar opening up impact. A third group you can turn to are elders. And elders have lived through this history. So on racial relations here in Boston, it really matters a lot when you bring together folks from Roxbury and from Southie who were living on either sides of the busing debate during that period of time. And particularly for the younger members in the community, it matters a lot to have an elder there who says, well, actually, I lived through that moment. And here's what we thought. Here's what we saw in those circumstances. And again, if you can bring elders together from across the black-white divide, for instance, in Boston, or whatever sort of ethnic division you may be working on, these individuals can play that kind of interesting opening up role. Lastly, are fact-finding committees. I think this is another really interesting tool that we can turn to. But these, in order to be able to work, they need to be balanced and credible. And so bringing members of the 2 communities that are in some sort of strife or conflict to come together for a fact-finding committee, to come together and to say, all right, we are going to go out and try to find out what exactly happened in these circumstances. What did the eyewitnesses say? What do the law enforcement officers say? What do the various leaders in these communities say? Now, note that these kind of vehicles I'm talking about, it's possible that they may produce some consensus. And that's great if they can. So if you bring the elders together, you bring together the researchers, the religious leaders, and so on, if they come to some consensus, they can go back to their communities and they can talk about what the history really looks like. But I think actually these groups may be just as important if they don't reach consensus, but if they muddy the waters. And muddying the waters of what exactly happened can sometimes be just as important as establishing the facts. If it can push me to sort of question my sense of history. So I'm an Israeli, I have a particular sense as to what happened in 1948. You're a Palestinian, you have a particular sense of what the facts were in the case. or I'm white and I lived in Southie, you're black, you lived in Roxbury at that time, the more that we can actually just muddy the waters and say, maybe my reading of history is not as correct or not as complete as I thought it was, that at least can open us up enough to say, well, how are we going to move forward with this? And moving forward is I think, in some sense, the most important part of what you can do with evidence and data-based approaches to trying to break open conflict. Lastly, let me just say that one important side effect, or perhaps maybe the most important aspect of these vehicles I'm talking about, interreligious approaches, historians, researchers, elders, fact-finding committees, is the status that they bring as authority figures in some way, shape, or form. And status is really important to engage, is that I think in addition to the conscious effects that we're talking about, is that status has subconscious effects or emotional impacts on the group that can help them to leapfrog the path that they would normally have to walk with each other in the sort of workshops that we tend to do in these fields, in the sense that when authority figures tell us something, it tends to have a little bit more emotional or subconscious weight. So in a religious interaction, because the imam told me that this is what's happening, because the pastor told me this is happening, then I have to do something with that. Or in perhaps a more science-oriented community, because the expert told me that this is what's happening, because the psychologist said this is so, then I have to deal with it. Or elders also in our communities, because the elder told me that this is what happened in 1974 in Boston, I've got to do something with that. I've got to open up in a way. And I need to move on in a way that if I was just interacting with people in a normal workshop environment, it may take me a much longer time to do that. So the role of these experts can be very, very important. And this lastly, I think, also suggests that these sort of vehicles I'm suggesting can be really interesting tactics or strategy for being facilitators themselves. Is that engaging these figures can be really interesting as facilitators in opening up the sorts of dialogues. And some sort of combination between us as facilitators and with experts in these processes can be a really, really interesting vehicle for change. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for your time.